to exploit its natural resources and workforce.
It's not even shadowy. You see, there's no great mystery about what's happening here and about the way the world operates. It's quite blunt. I mean, for the last 30 years, you've got something pretty much everywhere, well, it certainly spreads pretty much everywhere, that generally gets labelled neoliberalism, this idea that you should have floating exchange rates, weak regulation, particularly of financial markets, minimal government interference or involvement with what market does, and that's more or less how the world operates. And then there are institutions, and the outstanding one at this point is the IMF, that will actively try and enforce this state of affairs. So it's not greatly shadowy, if you see what I mean, that there are people behind the scenes somewhere trying to manipulate stuff. It's actually, this is quite overt. This is happening, and this is how, for my entire adult life, actually, is what it starts to look like. This is how the world has operated, and it's made some people very, very wealthy. It's produced enormous concentrations of wealth.
So when the International Monetary Fund comes in order to try and alleviate a country's debt problems, it imposes a set of conditions. And in the 1980s and 90s, they called that set of conditions structural adjustment programme. And it tends to take very similar forms wherever it happens. And indeed, we can see structural adjustment programmes, in essence, happening today in countries like Greece and Portugal and Ireland, where countries are instructed to decrease the amount that they spend on the public sector. They are instructed to liberalise their trade market and liberalise their capital market, so money can much more easily come in and out of their economy. And the idea is that this will encourage investment to come in from richer parts of the world, and that all of their problems will be solved from this investment. And in actual fact, this has proved time and time again to be completely without foundation. In actual fact, what happens is it destroys fledgling industries and capacities in these developing countries, and developing countries become completely dependent on goods and services from developed countries, and also from capital from developed countries. One of the things the International Monetary Fund is very keen on is telling countries to lower the taxes that should be paid by multinational corporations when they come and operate in a country, because then you'll encourage more multinational corporations to come in. Of course, what it also means is the profits that are made by those multinational corporations leave the country just as quickly, and the country itself doesn't benefit. And today you have many developing countries which have got almost no tax base. They've not developed a tax base at all, and so they're even more dependent on international capital markets, on the money markets, on creating debt. And that's why you have so many countries in the world that have really been robbed of their sovereignty. It's very difficult to see how democratic societies can evolve or function when actually a government is more dependent on the diktats of the International Monetary Fund and the money markets than it is on their own people.
What we've seen since the 1970s is a dramatic increase in a series of phenomena that have had a stimulative effect on the changes in the financial system that have brought us to the gleaming, shining metal and steel business that's over there. In case you don't know, that's the City of London I'm pointing at.
To compensate for the lack of a defined, commodity-based value underlying currencies, financial institutions developed securitization as a means to manage risk.
You develop securitization as a means to try and stabilize the whole system. This is a set of financial processes and financial innovations that really accelerate from the 70s, 80s onwards.
You had a chaotic system that needed to manage risk, and you had to innovate. You needed derivatives, options, futures. You have new markets in volatility management tools. Who knows what the term hedging is? Spreading your risk, managing your risk, insuring against your risk, precisely.
Up until very recently, up until the 1960s, the Securities and Exchange Commission would be quite clear that derivatives that weren't based on real products, like agricultural products, so pork belly futures or whatever, would in fact be essentially a kind of gambling, and therefore you weren't allowed to trade them. That changes in the 60s, and everybody can trade, currency futures, things that are not based on real products, being traded at some point in the future, but are based on movements of currency prices. Once you have the system of fixed exchange rates breaks down, obviously this thing accelerates enormously. So as you get the rollback of government regulation here, you get the market taking over with its own products here. And the theory is that the market's better at regulating itself, it's more stable than if you have the government interfering all the time. The efficient markets hypothesis, the idea that, you set up a financial market, they're fast, everybody in them is well informed, they all keep a very careful eye on what everyone else is doing, it'll therefore be very stable and it reflects real changes in the economy. It's not going to be driven by, panics and manias and speculative bubbles. None of this really going to happen. If there is movement up and down, it's because something real is happening and traders and investors in the financial market are responding to it. So that's the efficient markets hypothesis. The practice, and I think what you see in 2008 is a kind of end of that process. The appearance of a crisis so major, the belief that it will simply be self-stabilising and self-regulating really can't carry on. I mean, the practice carries on anyway, but you can't really argue in the same way that you used to, that it's good or it's necessary or this is okay for the world.
In the last decade, we had a new innovation, something called the credit default swap, a way of buying insurance against the company you've invested in going bust. And in 2002, they were worth in total less than $1 trillion. In 2007, they were worth $60 trillion. That's 5 years.
Everybody's suddenly sitting there and thinking, oh, these CDOs we've made don't in fact provide the kind of stability that we thought. The maths that's inside of them is complete nonsense, it turns out. There's far more risk attached to trying to securitise risk and securitise debt in the way that we have done this than we thought, and we think these things are now worthless. The attempt to get more and more complex ways of regulating and shaping a financial market and trying to make a quick buck out of it as well actually helped produce the opposite effect to what its kind of apologists said, which is that it led to a spectacular crash.
What we saw as a result of this very different situation was one phenomenon above all, one sector above all grew, and that was the financial sector.
While the financial sector benefits enormously from the current monetary system, the system is neither stable nor fair.
The assumption in what the Bank of England does right now is that the cash that we hold is backed up by government debt. The government can back up its promises by the fact that it can tax the public. So what they're implying is that cash is backed up by government debt when government debt is backed up by the ability of government to get cash from the public.
Time and time again over the last 30 years we've seen private debts being transformed into public debts, and ultimately the price of that debt is paid by the public in the debtor country.
This is why spending cuts are necessary. The system is designed to make certain people very rich at the expense of a nation's citizens and taxpayers. The system lowers the standard of living of the majority and distributes this wealth among the privileged.
So what we're left with is a financial system since the early 70s that has no fixed exchange rates, that suddenly has increasingly open financial borders, that has central banks having to manage without having any control because there's nothing here where the gold used to be, chaotically. They have to ease quantitatively. They have to lend as a lender of last resort.
Throughout history, monetary systems were designed to give the dominant international power an advantage, and this power is fiercely defended and expanded on.
And they flee in terror from an incredible bogeyman.
An American flag is burned at the height of the demonstration. Both President Johnson and Francisco Franco were vilified. A new low in public protest, added strain on Spanish-American relations.
Order in the court! Order in the court!
I want Americans and all the world to know.
Come on, fire!
I want Americans and all the world to know. America has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality.
Fire! Objection overruled!
What I would like to see is a new kind of currency that is backed by something that is scarce and that we really need and we really value, something like energy or renewable energy, for example. So a sort of kilowatt-hour backed currency would be very interesting to me. We need to start valuing the things that are most scarce and that we need to survive as a human race in the long run, and backing an international currency with something like that will generate enormous investment in, for example, renewable energy, if that's the primary international unit of account that's being used. Another option is a basket of currencies, so you mix up the value of different currencies to create a very solid currency that people have confidence in.
Perhaps even better would be a basket of commodities with which to back up international currencies.
Now, if it was possible, internationally, some way or another, to get all these competing and increasingly competing national economies together and say, we're all going to sit down and write out an agreement, somewhat like the Bretton Woods Agreement, which will allow for, unlike Bretton Woods, allow for some currencies to be pegged against different baskets of goods that are more appropriate to their national economies. And you can sort of arrange this. If you could arrange that to happen, then that would be nice, and you can see how that would start to create a kind of order in the international macroeconomy, which is otherwise lacking. The real difficulty there is just political. It's like, who on earth is going to do this? Who is the force that's going to kind of make this thing happen?
Creating a monetary system which is both fair and stable is possible and can be achieved. What are international organisations for, if not for such a purpose?
This is George. George worked in a big bank in the City of London. But one day, without warning, George's bank went bust. Luckily, the government rescued the bank and George kept his job. But the greedy government wanted something in return for their help. They demanded a higher tax on George's salary and bonus. For someone with a high-cost lifestyle like George, a shock like this can be devastating. Now George struggles to afford the rent on his riverside apartment in central London. The tyres on his Aston Martin are wearing thin and are barely road legal. Unless George's situation improves, or unless someone like you helps him, then George may even be forced to walk past the next Savile Row tailors and buy his suit from Topshop or Next. Even if George had anything to celebrate, he can no longer afford the champagne to celebrate with. George is not alone. Countless others are suffering like him, and no one knows how long it'll be until the good times return. But with your help, George can turn his life around. A simple monthly donation from you can bring a bit of sunshine back to George's life. Just £395 will help him celebrate minor achievements with a magnum of Cristal champagne. As little as £900 will help George buy a new set of tyres for his Aston Martin. £2,000 can help George recover his self-esteem with a suit from a prestigious Savile Row tailor. But even a small amount will help. Just £200 will buy a meal for George and his girlfriend Experience. Just £200 extra will buy the drinks. By adopting a banker, you won't just be supporting someone like George in a time of need. You'll also be supporting the trendy wine bars of the City of London, the luxury car makers of Italy, and the tailors of Savile Row. You'll be doing your patriotic duty to support Britain's greatest industry in its time of need. And when the good times return and George gets his bonus back, the taxes he pays will help fund the public services that the rest of you scroungers depend on. So please, until the good times return for George and those like him, will you give today?